So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Yashita now, who's now going to introduce our keynote speaker, Ofelia.
Thank you, Vera. Hi. Hello, my name is Mizuki Miyashita. It is a great pleasure to have Dr. Ofelia Zepeda here in Montana. And I am so honored to have this role of introducing her to you. Dr. Zepeda has earned PhD in linguistics at the University of Arizona in 1984. She is Regents Professor now of Linguistics and Head of Native American Studies at the same institution. And she is awarded a MacArthur Fellowship 1999 through 2004. And she's a linguist, poet, and language revitalizationist. She's also actively involved in Native American Linguistics MA program in University of Arizona. And Dr. Zepeda was awarded a variety of honors and awards, from being a distinguished scholar and outstanding writer. And she is one of the co-founders of American Indian Language Development Institute, also known as AILDI or ALDI. This program trains indigenous language teachers in linguistics and language revitalization. She has directed the program for many years, and she also taught courses, including creative writing in indigenous languages. There are pamphlets and the ads of this institute out in the gathering space. She has published a number of books and articles in fields of her expertise, including American Indian linguistics, American Indian bilingual education, American Indian language pedagogy, American Indian language policy, American Indian literature. And she is a native speaker of Tohono O'odham. Tohono O'odham is spoken in southwestern Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. Dr. Zepeda has published the first grammar book titled Tohono O'odham Grammar. The language has been taught for more than 30 years at the University of Arizona. And some years ago, I was an undergraduate student in her Tohono O'odham class. And I was so excited to learn about the language and so amazed. Did you remember this? So amazed by the structure of the language, often facing moments like, the language can do that? And I just fell in love with her for her intelligence and kindness. And my interest in her language became a big part of my schoolwork. And she always guided me to right directions. She was, and still is, my wonderful professor and mentor. And today, it is my dream come true moment for me to be able to invite her as a guest speaker and introduce her to you. The design of one of the ads contains autumn words in background. This is an ad in autumn I composed. I would like to read it with a translation on the screen. It has been many years since I graduated, but I was able to receive consultation from the expert yesterday, so I'm going to be reading the edited version. Ofelia Zepeda, Ashapchugik. Amohamashtam, Batas Mas Maunyokadak Old Namyok, Arizonatam. Hugyojum Hukit Nan Kumas Haiti Ohan. Spabiko Nyok, Spabiko Oimet. Sohoid, Batonyoka de Botam Yok. Hugyogmo Oji Chuat, Jusha Isis Cooked. Sohoid Gunan Kumas Hukmadikam Ida Uf. Mato Iya Jiohumo. Mato Yotunyui, Kuchtoyui, Kuchitui Yu. Abgu Ihihim, Yokai had Amto Sohoi Ofelia. Please welcome Ofelia Zepeda.
Pagi sapentat matabinyawai haka Mizuki so wasi japi mabiatip kadia University of Montana, Missoula. When si circuit ya jiwa ya hanyi itu mo ya oya po ya half chip kan ke amje Mizuki Kate Shanley chilun ikam David tam to take them with the go up anyway Dr. Prachita Sharma begin the baboti up man hagam boy ha sapoy ha winya new hagam ida what ha jawada moya what si kam and bihatan hagam mat hiwig man yaw oy madet yawani ka ha jawada. So it's my pleasure to be here, and also want to express my appreciation to my friend and former student, and still my student, Dr. Mizuki Miyashita, and also, of course, this visit here allows me to see people that I've known for quite some time now, including Kate Shanley and her husband David. And then to meet new people, especially from the creative writing conference that I'm also a part of here at the university. So I'm very happy to be here. And of course, Jesse's talk was very moving to me because Darrell Gibb was also a good friend of mine, and I hope that he's here with us today because he, of course, is a very strong advocate of language, and I had the pleasure of working with him at different times. We've served on different committees, national committees, met at different conferences every now and then, and we've brought him down to Tucson to spread the word about language revitalization. So we miss him, those of us that work in the field. And one thing I loved about Darrell is his undergraduate work was in literature, and he was a great fan of poetry, and I appreciated him as a supporter of not only my work, the work that we shared on language revitalization, but also our love of creative writing and poetry. So we had many things to talk about whenever we got together. So I think of him today, especially here in near his homeland. I'm glad that we had the two presentations earlier because I always want to think, when we talk about language revitalization, language maintenance, that we want to think that people, even a general audience, understands the situation that American Indian languages are in currently. And it's just not Native American languages. There's many languages around the world which, for a lot of different reasons, have been losing speakers with shifts towards the dominant language, and particularly towards English or other large dominant languages. So it's not, something happening just here in Montana. It's happening all over the place. Some places more extremely than others. So I'm just, making that assumption. People have some awareness that that's the situation. So I appreciate the two talks because they were talking about the different efforts that schools, community members, families, the efforts that they've been trying to make or participating in or advocating as far as language maintenance and revitalization is concerned. So that laid a nice foundation, I think. But I think it's important for all of us to be as informed as possible about the situation and to advocate for language revitalization and maintenance where you feel comfortable participating. And there's lots of opportunities for all the languages for anyone to participate and offer support. So today what I want to talk about, and sometimes I think when I choose a topic that it should be something much more sort of dramatic or sort of activist positioning, but because I was coming as part of the creative writing conference here, and Mizuki and I kind of talked about it, and we had some ideas about including writing, poetry, language, and advocating for both, sort of from a couple of angles. Even though the situation of language is very dire, you might think that writing poetry is like, what does that have anything to do with it? That we should be doing something more critical, collecting, filming, audio recording, speakers, and trying to capture as much, not necessarily that it's going to be gone tomorrow, but to capture it as much as possible, and having steady plans in that direction. But instead, I'm going to talk about sort of the creative end of language work. And I'm an advocate, even though this doesn't always happen in language maintenance programs, as Ms. Charlo was saying, there's so few people involved, two, speakers were involved starting the school, and then certifying teachers, and teachers are not good speakers, so you're always like taking a step forward, taking a step back. So there's always these challenges, and they're significant challenges. Or parents, having that attitude about, is an immersion school good enough? Is it high enough quality education to get my child to succeed at high school? That is very, very sad that attitude is there by the parents, but you can understand their trepidation. There's lots of history that unfortunately is part of American Indian education, or American education in general, that still has these parents thinking that way. When you put in front of them the model of the Hawaiian immersion schools, when they go from pre-K, to high school, to four-year college, to PhD in the Hawaiian language. And so you can succeed in the language. But still, that's not enough evidence for parents today. And especially here on the mainland U.S., where languages are, languages other than English, I suppose, are supported or endorsed or promoted. So there's still, like I said, lots of challenges. But anyway, my original point was that when language maintenance programs, projects, efforts happen for a particular language, I think it's very important to have as many people participating in it as possible. Any range of community member can participate. Even if they're not speakers, they can participate. There's a professor that writes about language documentation, and I saw the term the first time in some of his literature, and he talks about the different types of people that can be involved in language documentation and maintenance programs. And so of course there's the speakers, there's what they call semi-speakers, people that only speak up to a certain level. That is, if you put it by grades or something like that, or if you give different numbers, and this is a way of sort of measuring proficiency that was asked earlier. And then there are non-speakers that can also be part of language maintenance programs. And then there's a category that he labeled rememberers. He's got another ER on the end, rememberers. And these are people that don't speak the language, and these are oftentimes elders. They don't speak the language, but they remember a lot about the culture of the people, their own people. And so they can be part of a conversation about language, and it'll help them contribute to the effort because they also have a memory, even though, like I said, they may not be active speakers. So don't be afraid to participate and be a supportive when you're called. So having a number of people participating allows us, the people to do the language teaching, people to administrate the schools, people to be the certified teacher, people to be the actual speakers in the schools and the community. And you can have policy makers who may or may not be speakers. And then you can have the creative people, the scientists, in that whole realm. Because that's the way it should be. That's the way it is for the English language. In English speakers, you have scientists and medicine people and poets and writers, philosophers, linguists, anthropologists, and so forth. And it can be the same in our languages. And so I think, the creative part, even though it is a significant part of tribal languages, because all tribes have oral literatures, we have our stories, we have our songs, ceremonial language, and so forth. So we've had that there. But what some of us have been doing is trying to sort of move it around in different realms, I guess. And then some of us, too few of us though, have been writing in our native language, which I think should be advocated for. But it's something that's kind of rare though, to have people write in their native language in general. And then, of course, to write creative work in the native language also is fairly rare. So today what I want to talk about is the role of, that oral form that was collected early on, whether it was sometimes by your own tribal members, and then sometimes by anthropologists and linguists and ethnographers, sometimes in collaboration with speakers, sometimes not, so good collaboration. But there we have it. These documents are there. They're in your libraries, in your archives, in your museums, and so forth, in your tribal libraries and collections sometimes. So these pieces of literature exist. And I believe that these early collections have a great deal to offer in all areas of language maintenance and revitalization. Because, like for instance, as Jesse said, when the question about fluency, that because you're a speaker of the language doesn't mean you know everything. All of us here speak English, but how many of us can answer a question about brain surgery, for instance? We don't have the vocabulary for brain surgery, or about rocket science. But it's just rocket science. So even as a speaker of the language, that doesn't mean you have, all the knowledge there is that is held in that language. It's the same thing for American Indian languages. You can't know everything. So that's why we have lots of people in different areas of expertise, and they will know those parts. And they will be the keepers of that part. They'll be the teachers of those areas, and you can go to them and ask questions and so forth. So we know we still have those types of people, different knowledge holders and so forth, and we know for some of us we can go to them and ask questions. But for some languages, we don't have those speakers anymore. We don't have those members in our tribes anymore. And so we're left with a printed form that was collected early or fairly recently, like I said, by outsiders sometimes, and sometimes by your own members. And so we can go to those products. We can go to the libraries and start looking them up. And so even though, as Mizuki said, my first language is Aodam. That's all I spoke as a child and learned English after 8 years old when I went to school. But we only spoke it in school when we went home, and I always described this about myself and my cousins and my sisters. The bus would drop us off, about a quarter mile from our house. And you get off to school, and I remember very clearly we're walking, goofing around, walking to our house, and we start shifting back to Aodam. Your mind and everything else just starts to switch. Nobody told us, it just starts to happen, and you start all talking in Aodam again. By the time you get to the house, your mother's there, and your older aunts or something like that, and you have no problem. You just walk in and you moved, shifted completely over. And that was a very natural way of us growing up as, I think, very strong bilingual children, in the most natural way, having the language always at home. And then when you go to school, it was English only. And eventually when we learned English, we somehow functioned and performed in the way that you were expected. So even though, like I said, my first language is Aodam, just like any speaker of English, there are some things I don't know that I might be curious about, and I will go through. And we don't have very good dictionaries, actually, as Mizuki will attest, trying to study Aodam. We have a little skinny dictionary that's basically a word list. And then we have another one, is a 2-volume dictionary that Mizuki spent a lot of time on, actually. But it's out of print. It's not accessible to everybody. It's been out of print for, 20 years now, maybe. And I would go to those dictionaries. I think of something. How would you say that? I've never heard somebody say this. And especially the larger dictionaries, sometimes I'd find it there, sometimes I wouldn't. And the little dictionary was kind of useless to somebody like me who has more vocabulary than what's in that little dictionary. And then the other source I went to were collections that people had done earlier. And so I added to my knowledge and to my vocabulary of Aodam by looking at other people's work, just like you would as a reader, a speaker of English. Same parallel, same thing can happen. So today what I want to talk about a little bit more specifically is just to give some examples of what I mean about referring to other works. And originally I was going to use other languages, but I sort of ran out of time, and I only used Aodam. So I tried to translate as much as possible so you don't get too lost. So my title has just general and broad about Native American poetics in language revitalization and documentation. And so I tried to give a brief definition of poetics, which deals with literary forms, for instance. And, there's a whole field of academia that studies poetics, but, we won't go that far at all. But I give you a brief description here that the writer Leslie Silko had in one of her essays that appeared back in 1981. And if you read it, it should remind you of the way people talk, that is, many Native people talk. She talks about it as looking more like a spider web. You go here and there, and you're listening, and you wonder, where are we going? And you just have to wait, and eventually you'll get your answer, or you'll get to the end of the story. So Native American poetics often has that type of shape, goes and crosses and comes back, and eventually the point or the meaning is made. And that's why we find, as what April was saying about timing, keeping time, because you can go off. So anyway, so I give that little brief definition. So in talking about language and, in my case, poetry, that language is complex. I mean, it's just no getting around it. Those of us who are language teachers, we try and remember never to say that a language is either hard or easy. Okay? And we try and ingrain that in native language teachers as well, because they often use that as an excuse not to teach it, or not to study it, or learn it. So Jesse's examples up here, where the words look this long, and people are going to think, oh, that's going to be a hard language, To me, it's a complex language, It's not hard, it's complex. That doesn't necessarily make it hard. Okay. They're also very creative, and I'm glad Jesse gave his examples already. They're creative. I love the term that he gave us for mountain, pushed up, which, that's it says a lot about traditional knowledge of the people, what they hold and how they understand their environment. And they have an understanding of geology, which is it's a hard science. And that knowledge of geology is held in the language. Who knew? So they are creative and complex systems. Like I said, no language is simple or easy. No language is hard or challenging. All of them is not. Not challenging. It's not a complex. You can talk about complexity of range of complexity of languages. Say if Mizuki was studying Blackfoot, and then she studied O'odham, she could make a comparison. Structures are very different. One is accessible from a particular point, and the other one from another, and so complexities will vary. So anyway, I just want to point that out about language, in case you were unaware, but you should be. And then, of course, we have, as I mentioned, all of our orality is still there for many, many of us. Some of them, people are going back to, sort of pulling them out, reviving them, and so forth. Especially songs that are related to ceremonial ritual and so on. I've seen a lot of that happening. But those forms of the language, I think, as I mentioned already, very important sources for a lot of things when it comes to language maintenance and revitalization. They are excellent sources of if you want to call it proper language use, proper in the sense that it's the way older people speak. Because you know, those of you that speak a language or studying a language know that there's change. Language has changed. We don't speak the way, say, our great-grandparents spoke. They change, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's not a bad thing. It's a natural process of language. All languages do that. And so when your grandma and grandpa tells you you don't speak right, that's not what they really mean. What they mean is you don't speak the way we used to speak. So don't take it personally. They don't know how else to say it. They always just say that you said it wrong. You don't speak right. You don't sound the way it used to be. So don't let that stop you. So anyway, so those sources, give you all of these forms of language use, specialized form, innovative and creative forms. They're all out there, either in the speaker or in some collected works on the language and its oral form. So one thing that I think is fun to do, and I end up doing it myself every now and then, is finding old words and making them new. I don't necessarily change the word, I just move it into a more contemporary setting so that it's accessible to more people. But I have to know the word, I have to use it right and in the right context when I move it. And as I asked earlier, if doing this kind of thing, playing with language for the purpose of creative form and poetry, is it as important as documenting our oldest speakers, our last few remaining speakers? Some people might not think, sitting around and looking through dictionaries is as important. And that's where the situation of having more or larger numbers of people working on a particular language or working with a particular language. That way you have different people doing different things. It's very common for language programs to have 2 or 3 people working on it for years. And what happens? They get burned out and they leave, they get frustrated, and people blame them, But it is very difficult and stressful work to work with your own language, especially, and at the school level. So I have great admiration for people who are in their tribal schools. So anyway, so I give you a real quick autumn example here of one that I took advantage of. And there's this book that's been around for a while, not that long, 1979, I believe. 1979. It was called Rain House and Ocean, Speeches for the Papago Year. That's what we used to be called, the Papago Year. And the texts were collected by Ruth Underhill, one of the early sort of ethnographers of different tribes, and she was out in the Southwest as well. And Don Bars, also an anthropologist who was at Arizona State University. And then these 3 men, Baptista Lopez, Jose Pancho, and David Lopez, all from the community of Santa Rosa on the O'odham Reservation. And these 3 men were also traditional healers and traditional singers and traditional storytellers. And all 3 men, I think maybe one of them spoke a little bit of English, but the others, their main language is O'odham. Anyway, this collection is a very nice collection in that it includes oral texts about O'odham and their ritual language and oratory around rain, the ocean, hunting, warfare, different tribal cultural practices. And so the text on one column is in O'odham, the next one is in English. And So because I didn't know these men, I only knew them by the work they contributed to this collection. And so because I am, I can read all of them. So when I read through here, I found words I never ever heard of. They're words actually that would not come up in everyday conversation. Words that my mom and dad and my aunts and uncles never used because they never had a discussion about the ocean waves, things like that. So I didn't think we had a word for a wave, ocean wave. And then I found it here. I looked in the other dictionaries, it's not in there. And I deliberately was looking for the word, some word. So I assume we had something because all of them are very, connected to the ocean. Because, that's the direction our rain comes from. And so our ritual includes references to the ocean and ocean birds and things like that. Anyway, so on my little handout, I gave you the word kachk, and I glossed it as ocean. And fjord is the one I found in this literary text. Fjord means a wave. And I also found a phrase in here. It reads, and that's what they said. It means crashing of a wave, the sound it makes and the way it looks and so forth. And like I said, words like that would never appear in conversation. And so I didn't know them, and so I found them. And there's some words that are already in the language, and I've heard them before. Tam kachim is another one. Because it's descriptive, it just means the place above, or else in the, say for instance, in creation story, the sky, a world, a different place. And then for Christians, they've now extended it to mean heaven. And then another word I found was kukuim. I didn't know that word, but it refers to all the sounds that bird-like things can make, chirps and whistles and so forth. And so anyway, so there were actual vocabulary words that I found in other texts. And then I found references to traditional practices, which I knew of, but I found different contexts for them and had a better understanding of some of them because of the early collections in oral literature. And so what I found myself doing was being able to move some of these words into some poem that I wrote. And as Mizuki said, I've been writing, both in autumn and English. And so I have this piece here which starts on one page and continues to the next. And I'll just read it for you. And this is the one, as you can see, I think I put in bold print the words, my new words, the words that I found in the existing oral literature, and incorporated them here in this poem. And I'll just read this for you. And I titled it, This is How We Know Things. The nyok at the noak chohi amkach kui tata. Sapmo a mohasma sekyot matam uda putan ikay. Amo a mohusi good mohas jud I the gok the munchip amjid the bahaganyai. Humuas apmo a munsihas urid mot imik. We travel carrying our words. We arrive at the ocean. We're able to speak of the sounds of thundering waves, of thunderous waves. We speak of how big it is and of the power that gives us songs. We, of course, speak of how we respect it and call it our relative. The nyok at the moak chohi, amdam kachim we tata, Amionye nan komas nyen etam hai chutatakam. Eda shoy kam ta hadak. Amawa ka kuku impimai. Et piotana komat moa mohasmas matas uri. Net biga kuku impimai. Et pimat mat pot imadak. Et piotana komat moa mohasmas matas uri. Net biga kuku impimai. Et pima mat pot imik. We travel carrying our words. We arrive in the sky world. There we see all the various animals of flight. There is a feeling of sorrow. They have no knowledge of their songs, whistles, cooing, and chirping. We are not able to speak of what they look like, nor how we feel about them, because they have lost their songs, and we do not know if they are a relative. So anyway, so I was able to use my new words in my poetry. And so I make my point at the bottom that in moving these words into this setting, perhaps it'll allow a larger audience, say Autumn audience, Autumn readers, to find these new words the way I found them, but to find them in the way that I've used them. And then, of course, for or studier or students of the language, again, it's another source for finding sort of unique words and phrases. So just real quickly, I want to point out that when I found these words, like I said, it was the words I didn't know, kyort, for the word for wave. Because of the way that it's used in its original source, it uses it, and I give a little example of the sentence. It says, "Aboit ki upkyor," continuing, it made a wave. And then in the second little appearance again, and the second line of it, it says, "Aboit ki kyor," continuing, it made 4 waves, meaning 4 of them came rolling, I guess. So because I have the number 4 in front of kyort, that says to me that kyort is a mass noun, like the word water, or rice, I guess, in English. You don't say rice, you just say rice. So it doesn't act the way other nouns do when it forms plural. It does this thing called reduplication, for those of you linguistics people. And I gave a little example about dog. You have goks, meaning one dog, and kokoks, meaning more than one dog. So just from, a couple of words, from a completely different source that I had the book for a long time, but I never looked at it as closely as I did when I wanted to write about the ocean and ocean waves. And move them into a piece of poetry, and so I was able to do that. So my main point is that in working with language revitalization, it doesn't just always have to be sort of teaching word lists, because like Jesse said, TPR, immersion, just using it as a form. But he had that little picture of himself with his little braids, and he had writing on the whiteboard. So I'm glad that I saw that picture, even though he's talking also about TPR, which is completely oral language use with physical activity involved. So a range of methods, help you to learn the language. And that's because that's a very natural approach. It's just like we always say, well, your mother didn't sit around talking to you with lists. She talked to you while she was cleaning, washing dishes, and all kinds of things, and you eventually, picked it up. So, opportunities can be there or can be created sort of in, artificially, but that's fine too, because sometimes that's all we have. And then, the literature form is there as well, and perhaps not to ignore it or not to forget about it. But that doesn't mean that the one language teacher should be doing all these things, trying to teach, about language and culture, and think they have to do the literature too. Somebody else can pick up that portion and contribute it, just like, other languages around the world. But let me stop there, because we're running out of time, and Mizuki has a lot of food in the other room. I saw that. So let me start there. Okay.
So we have some time for questions. Anybody has any? There's a microphone here. But,
Okay.
My question is, I've always known this to be your brilliance, that you write poetry, and of course I value that. And your explanation about taking the old words and using them in a new context makes me think about things like, as objectionable as salvage anthropology was in many respects, because it was undergirded with the idea that Native people should, not only were disappearing, but should disappear, and that things should be saved before they're gone, kind of idea. But still, those are the texts that are recoverable now. And it strikes me in what you're saying that you're creating recoverable texts. And I'd like you to talk about that larger academic business of pulling together the resources for studying language. I remember, for example, myself, I studied Lakota for my PhD language. I'm not fluent, but I used to have a reading knowledge anyway. And I remember sitting on the floor in the stacks of a graduate library at the University of Michigan and finding a text that had the vocables that my grandmother would use sitting around with the other old ladies. It was a wonderful kind of discovery of something recorded, and so anyway, I'm asking a large, broad, historical, political question, but
as I mentioned earlier, that there are different tribes, the various tribes, say just in the U.S., where they have no speakers, or they have 2, 3, and of course those speakers are elderly. And so in the case of California, my friend and colleague, Dr. Leanne Hinton, when she works with those, very decimated languages, the goal of the older adults who want to do some kind of just basic documentation, critical documentation, they are recording these speakers as quickly as they can, while they have another group, and that's why her summer workshops are so important, is to train community members to do just that, to go to those archives at the universities, to the Smithsonian, whether they're linguistic or anthropological. Some are religious, religious in the sense of Christian material, to be able to find them, and then they're given training in how to access them. Because even though, there might be a lot written up by a particular language, but oftentimes, someone who's a speaker of the language can look at it and it'll look like, just absolutely incomprehensible, and it's intimidating to look at that because it's written for a totally different audience and purpose. So bringing those types of material sort of home and saying there's a way to get at this information that's going to help us, with our maintenance or revitalization effort. And that's something that many tribal people are oftentimes intimidated to do, because they have to find sometimes a linguist, who will understand why they want to access this material. And also what they want to do with it once they have sort of found the key to it. Because many of them want to take that early literature and move it towards language teaching, something more pedagogical or something like that. And it's a difficult thing to do, you know, for tribal people to go and talk to some anthropologist, you know, and get buy-in from them, or to a linguist and get buy-in from them, or even the early missionaries that may be retired now but may still be active, to go and talk to them and get buy-in from them, and sort of turn the table around and bring that, you know, those documents, you know, basically home and make them useful and usable somehow. But it's a tremendous effort. And a classic example is something very contemporary with the Wampanoag people. You know, they started to bring their language back, and it was because it was well documented, but only in a Bible. And Jessie Little Doe Baird, the woman who initiated that, I went to her home when she was in the middle of doing that, and she had a Xerox copy of that Bible, and the Xerox version was like this thick, and it was sitting on her kitchen table, and she had all these little colored flags on different pages, and it was just laid out. And going back, sort of doing, you know, what I did, finding words and putting them in modern setting, so that it could be useful in their language teaching programs. So it can be done, but it's like anything else. It's can be almost a devotion to make that decision that you're going to go to that source that was ours, but it was kind of like taken away, and it's been sitting in museums or libraries, you know. First of all, to make that decision, because there's some people that they'll say, you know, it's like material that was stolen, was taken without permission, you know, we're not going to go there. You know, we're going to do it ourselves. And that's, I think, a noble position, but sometimes I think it's an ignorant decision to take. Because you just need as much help as possible for many languages. That's their situation.
Thank you.
David?
I'm curious, the classes at UA for decades now, they use poetry in the learning process.
For the language classes, you mean? Yeah, there's referencing the University of Arizona. I always claim, at least for the state of Arizona, we've always offered the Autumn language class, which I've done. I created that course. We've always offered Navajo language classes, and at the undergrad level. And we've been doing it for Autumn, definitely for, how long have you been out? No, 30 years or so. I've been there for over maybe 25 years. Navajo about the same number of years. We also offered Hopi until the instructor passed away, the late Emery Zekikwaktewa. But we offered them every year for credit. And then we also have provisions to where native speakers can take a proficiency test in the language and meet their foreign language requirements. So I test for Autumn and Accurate Autumn. My colleague tests for Navajo and sometimes reluctantly Apache, because they're close languages. And then we have a faculty in the College of Ed who tests for Hopi speakers. The other, the Emery Sekikwaktua, because he was a storyteller and so forth, and his mother was a traditional storyteller, he used a lot of that content for his language teaching. And Dr. Willie is kind of like more, he's our most, the Navajo language, she's more of a straight linguist. And so she comes at it from there, although she likes to do storytelling as well from her own knowledge for teaching language. And then I also incorporate little stories. In fact, that's how I got started writing poetry in O'odham, was because of my O'odham language class. There was an assignment to write. We didn't even call it poetry. We used to like write something that we can share and read. And they came back what I thought was very, poetry-like, and I formatted them that way. And they were all in O'odham, and that's how we got started. And we got published too later, my students and I. So we use it because it does allow. It's a form of writing that is not intimidating for some reason. It's not intimidating because that, you're not writing a great big essay. And it's also very creative, and that creative element allows people to, I think, be experimental, and you don't have to worry about grammar and so forth. So I think people find it easy to write something poetic in the language. And so the thing is, though, so say for instance, I have, my little collection here that's bilingual as well. You have O'odham and English on this side. The way that I do, my own writing, I write something in O'odham. I don't do translation. I just create something similar in English over here. So students of the languages, it would be difficult for them to use this to figure out, what's going on, because it doesn't really match. And so if I give them an O'odham piece, I won't give them my English version. I'll only give them the O'odham version, and we only work with this. And they'll come up with their own English form, or I'll give them the English form, and they'll come up with their own O'odham form. So yeah, so it's sort of, I think we're just sort of experimenting, because why not? Yeah, thank you, David.
I just any quick questions. Well, like when learning language, a lot of people I notice, especially adults, they struggle with this structural difference between native language and English. And I think that poetry, it can be that great step, because learning and studying poetry, it doesn't have the same structural rules as writing an essay, or same boundaries. It's kind of more diverse. And that's why I try to say it needs to tweak some stuff, thinking in the language. But I was wondering if you incorporate poetry with elementary learners of Tohono O'odham, or if they learn that in a more advanced class.
Yeah, I can use it at any level, because say for us, and it's similar across other tribal languages, where their oral literature is largely what holds it together. It's a repetition pattern. And so what are you supposed to do when you're learning a language? Repetition, repetition, repetition. And so O'odham oral literature, especially songs and some story form, do that. There'll be a phrase or just something even shorter. It'll keep showing up. Repetition, and students will remember those phrases. It might be in a dialogue, Coyote said, something, and he says it again, and he says it again. And it sticks in the learner's head, and then they can put it in other contexts. So yeah, so no, you can use it at, beginning or more advanced level. The ones I find with my colleague, Dr. Willie, who's the Navajo language teacher, because the Navajo has this very rich, philosophy of different ways that the people must live by and so forth. And those are complex, and so, they have this kind of hierarchy. Only certain people really understand those. So she doesn't feel comfortable bringing that into a class for people that are just now learning the language, because it's just too abstract, You have to have more language, understand the meaning more before you can get to those philosophical complex ideas. So she can tell where she has to draw the line, And as a language teacher, you have a sense of your students and where you can take them. So with poetry, you can start at any point, and like I said, using the repetitive form, supports the theory of language learning, repetition.
One more.
Yeah, I didn't have a question, just a speculation. So I was wondering whether creative uses of language, like writing poetry, might be used not only to teach new speakers, but to heal, for speakers who are elderly and were traumatized in the boarding school experience, maybe if writing poetry might be used to heal that trauma. And I just thought of it because there's so many studies now talking about how various kinds of creative activities, especially moving things around, even though they're not usually talking about words, helps actually heal. So I just occurred to me.
Yeah, I believe in that, it's one thing to sort of think about, things, or else think about your pain, whatever it might be, whatever kind of pain, even, certainly physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain, whatever it is. But that to write it down is a form of therapy, and it's a form of release. And I do that for myself, and I tell, not everyone, but I have my brother-in-law is having lots of physical ailments, and he likes to write. He's a cowboy, and he'd share his poetry with me. He's sort of like a cowboy poet. He writes about his horses and riding, and so he shares them, and it's pretty good poetry actually. But now he's having lots of health problems, and he's just angry and frustrated because he can't do the things he used to because of his ailments. And I said, you should write down, how you feel. I said, it may help you. So I don't know if he's done that yet. But I haven't myself, talked to people about writing, whether it's writing in all of them, but definitely writing, even if they're writing in English, because even if they're writing in English, they can talk about that kind of, from their own perspective, from their family or their own view, how they see things and are feeling things. So even if they're doing it in English, I think it's good. I'd be really curious to see what you get if they write in their native language for the purposes of healing. I've never seen that done, so it'd be interesting. I've heard it orally, so I kind of know that, and it may be very similar in writing. I know that when tribal people get together and they're talking about language, especially when they're just starting to, plan some form of language revitalization effort, the first thing that always happens, and it's sort of unplanned, they go through, and the people have labeled it as sort of like a mourning phase. They mourn not the language, but what happened. What happened, and then here we are now. And so they know that mourning is a form of healing. You do it, and then you have a point where it starts to kind of fade down, and then you can go from there. And so I've seen and heard people through our Language Institute, when people come together and they tell us about their language and the decisions that they had to make about their language. They mourn. I mean, literally, it's like mourning at a funeral. You know, they cry, and then some where they have to tell stories. They tell stories, and then they put it behind them, and then they start the plans, the specific plans for their language program. So like I said, I've seen them do it orally. I've never seen them do it in writing, in poetic form. So it might certainly look very similar, or it might not. I don't know. So, yeah, thank you for your question.
So please join me in thanking Dr. Zepeda.